Hi there. This month I want to talk with you about understanding unhealthy and toxic bonds, specifically trauma bonds and betrayal bonds. Now, as Christian counselors, we work with traumatized people all the time, and so I want you to understand what these trauma bonds are and how they're formed. And then next month, in next month's video, I'll give you some things that you can do to help your clients detach and heal from trauma or betrayal bonds. First, it's really important for our clients to understand and be reminded that we are, as human beings, bonding beings. God has hardwired us to connect. It's in our DNA and our brain chemistry. To not attach or not bond means something's dreadfully wrong inside. And even more exciting now, neuroscience can now explain biologically how bonding happens. We all know a newborn baby must bond or attach with its mother, or he or she will not develop properly. And a mother must bond with her baby in order for her to be able to attune properly to him or her. Attunement is also a critical skill for us as counselors, because it means that we are able to get on the same wavelength as our counselees, and it helps us to create an environment of safety and trust and facilitates building that therapeutic relationship. Now, biologically, one of the things that helps in that mother-infant bonding experience is the release of a hormone called oxytocin during labor contractions and after childbirth. And this feel-good hormone, oxytocin, is called the bonding hormone. Neuroscience has discovered that oxytocin is also released when two people have sex together, which bonds or glues their relationship. And perhaps that's one reason why God tells us not to be sexually intimate with someone that we're not legally bonded to in marriage. And that topic can be for a whole other day. But whether our clients consciously want to or not, they do become bonded with someone during a sexual relationship. That's what releases the oxytocin. And the relationship, if it's not a committed one, this chemical, emotional bonding makes the breakup that much more painful. Just one more thought on this topic. Premature sexual bonding with someone can also make the relationship much more confusing. Let me give you an example. I remember working with a young widow, who I'll call Amy, who lost her husband at 27 years old with a battle to leukemia. And she was left with a young child and a broken heart. And her husband's best friend, John, was also devastated by the loss of his friend. And so Amy and John formed an intense emotional bond through the trauma of both losing their best friend and her husband. And their grief and loneliness and trauma bond made them vulnerable. In a few short weeks, they began a sexual relationship, which bonded them together even further. And before long, Amy and John decided to get married. But something inside of Amy knew that this relationship was different than her first marriage. And so she asked me to do some premarital counseling. When I first saw them together, they were living together, and they both knew it was wrong, but they were in love and bonded, and so they wanted to make it official by getting married. But within the first 30 minutes of our time together, I knew that John and Amy were not a good fit for marriage. They bonded over a trauma and tragedy and cemented it with a generous dose of good sex. So what I did was I asked them if they'd be willing to try an experiment. I would only do their premarital counseling if they would agree to live apart for 2 months and abstain from any sexual relationship. I wanted them to see that their relationship was void of any substance beyond their joint grief and good sex. And in less than a month, they both agreed that their relationship was not marriage material. It was a trauma bond, a bond that developed when going through a horrible death of Amy's husband and John's best friend. While watching him waste away, they both felt helpless and fearful and leaned on one another for support. And this shared experience and mutual grief, followed by an intense sexual relationship, created a strong bond, but it was not a healthy relationship. Therefore, it's important for us to tell our clients that they can be strongly bonded to someone who may be toxic for them. Let me say this again because it feels so foreign. It's almost as if we believe that if we feel strongly bonded or connected to someone, it's automatically assumed that the relationship is healthy and strong and safe and loving. But that's not necessarily true. Trauma bonds are formed when people experience something together that's horrible, scary, fearful, overwhelming, or traumatic. For example, war vets feel very close to one another when they share a foxhole, or when they're ambushed by the enemy and they had to fight together for their very lives, or they've lost comrades together from their unit. Firefighters or police agents work together in life-threatening situations, and they form strong bonds with their partners and colleagues that are critical to the functioning of the unit. People who experience natural disaster, like Hurricane Katrina or flooding in a city where everyone pulls together to help one another, they form bonds, trauma bonds, that would not have formed had they not experienced this tragedy together. And these bonds often are lifelong, and they're not a bad thing. In fact, sharing a trauma and bonding together with others can help build resilience and strength when people bundle together and go through a trauma as a group instead of all alone. So where a trauma bond becomes toxic and unhealthy is when there's an intentional use of fear, often coupled with intense sex, which creates an unhealthy attachment or trauma bond. Here are a few examples from publicly known cases of trauma bonding. Now, when I was in college a long time ago, there was a college student about my age named Patty Hearst, Patricia Hearst. Perhaps you've heard of her. She was 19. She went to Berkeley University in San Francisco, and she lived with her boyfriend. And a group of men and women broke into her apartment, guns drawn, beat up her boyfriend, and threw her into the trunk of their car. She'd been kidnapped by a group of armed radicals that billed themselves as the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA. Now, the SLA were a band of domestic terrorists, and they were very dangerous. They'd already shot 2 California school officials with cyanide-tipped bullets, killed one, and seriously wounded the other. And so they kidnapped Patty Hearst to get the country's attention, because Patricia Hearst was from a very wealthy and powerful family. Her grandfather was the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. And the SLA's plan worked, and it worked well. The kidnapping stunned the country and made national news. But the SLA had more plans for Patty Hearst, and they began abusing and brainwashing her, hoping to turn this young heiress from the highest reaches of society into a poster child for their coming revolution. And she began to sympathize with her captors and their cause. As they explained their goals to her and their grievances against the establishment, and they entitled her high empathy for their cause, coupled perhaps with some false guilt at being in the privileged class, made her an easy target. And only a few short months later, after she was kidnapped, the SLA released a videotape with her saying that she'd joined their cause to free the oppressed, and even had taken on a new name, and she changed her name to Tanya. Only about 2 weeks later, she was spotted on a bank surveillance camera wielding an assault weapon during an SLA bank robbery, barking orders to bystanders, providing cover for Confederates. Later, she was caught, tried, and found guilty of bank robbery and sentenced to jail. But her story was not a story of a young person turned terrorist, but a tragic story of trauma bonding, a mixture of extreme fear and helplessness at the hands of her captors, and confusion of love and sex as one of the captors began a sexual relationship with her, putting together intermittent abuse, brainwashing by defining good as now bad, right is now wrong, wrong is now right, bad is now good, coupled with moments of kindness and care. Now, this event happened long before professionals understood trauma bonding and its impact on the mind and souls of individuals. But Patty Hearst spent 2 years in prison, but later she was released and pardoned because they understood trauma bonding more. 2 other more recent kidnap victims, J.C. Dugard and Elizabeth Smart, were both young women kidnapped by older men and held captive for years against their will. When you are afraid, dependent upon the goodwill for your very survival, repeatedly raped, brainwashed as to what's true and false, and treated with intermittent kindness, you get very confused indeed. You're too scared to leave and too scared to speak up, and the bad guy is sometimes the good guy who's nice to you and shows you something that feels like care and love. I remember reading the story of J.C. Dugard, and she said after he'd raped me, he'd bring me a milkshake in my favorite flavor, and I began to feel like he really must care about me. Now, before I talk more about trauma or betrayal bonding, I think it's really important that we review the impact of living in a destructive and abusive marriage and the impact that it has on our clients, because trauma bonding or betrayal bonding is not synonymous with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or complex traumatic stress disorder. But living with a destructive person is harmful to our clients' physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and relational health. How harmful? No one can say for sure, because it depends on the abuse, our client's own resiliency and support, as well as how often and how severe the abuse is happening. But she may show signs of complex traumatic stress disorder or major depression if she's in a destructive marriage. She also may be struggling with chronic health issues due to the stress, and she may have lost her ability to think for herself. She may even feel and act a little unstable and react sinfully to her husband's controlling and destructive behavior, which we've already talked a lot about in our Equip group phone calls. But be discerning here. When a couple presents in counseling, and he's sitting there cool as a cucumber, and she is hysterical and angry, and it makes her look like the unhealthy or crazy one, and you as the counselor may even start to have a lot of empathy for her husband for having to live with such an angry woman, think again. She may be trying to tell you she's been traumatized, and her ability to regulate her own emotion has been damaged. Now, in your handout, I've given you 2 charts outlining the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and complex traumatic stress disorder. I'm not going to go into detail on this today, as I want to get to the trauma bonding part. However, let me just highlight some of the differences. In post-traumatic stress disorder, it's usually a one-time incident, and the trauma source is usually not an intimate relationship. That's different with CTSD. It's usually multiple trauma, and the source of trauma is an intimate relationship. The highest incident of post-traumatic stress disorder is with war vets, but the highest incident of CTSD is for those who've been abused as children or those in destructive marriages or domestic violence. Also, when we assess for complex traumatic stress disorder, we see often evidence of depression because they often go together. But if you only deal with the depression and not the PTSD, your client cannot heal. And truthfully, you can only deal with the complex traumatic stress disorder once a client has ended the relationship, because otherwise she continues to be traumatized. And the primary reason our clients continue to get traumatized is she's unable to break away. And that brings us back to our topic. Why is someone unable to end the relationship with their abuser? Now, obviously, for some of our clients, there are economic reasons as well as fear for young children or fear spiritually that she's sinning and doing the wrong thing. But for a lot of women, the reason is that they're not able to let go and they're bonded in a trauma bond. There's a glue, a bonding agent that holds her to him even after she knows the relationship is dangerous and destructive. She's unable to let it go. She may even be separated in a shelter, but she's still texting, engaging, hoping, waiting for him to wake up to change, to become the man she sees he could be. So let me just talk a little bit more about how trauma bonds and betrayal bonds form, and then in next month's video, I'll give you some practical ways to help you begin to break them. First, toxic trauma bonds are seen to develop from three specific things in abusive relationships: one partner's need for control, intermittent good and bad behavior, and fear. And we saw those things demonstrated in the extreme cases where the woman was kidnapped and formed trauma bonds with her captors, but let's look at how it happens in pretty common relationships. As hard as it is for us non-abused people to get it, when you've been a victim of repeat abuse, you often do develop emotional trauma bonds toward your abuser. This often starts in childhood, where a child felt compassion and loyalty toward his abusive parent, whether the abuse was physical, psychological, or sexual. Our client still loves and is often fiercely loyal to his parent. What happens in a child's thinking is that they tend to see periods of non-abuse, like we've looked at earlier in the abuse cycle, as evidence that they are loved and cared about. For a woman, she might say, "See, he did take me to dinner. It's proof the relationship isn't as bad as I thought. See, he was nice to me. He said he was sorry, or showed some remorse, or brought me flowers, or said he loved me. See, he's not that bad. I'm just too sensitive. I just need to try harder. I'm wanting too much. He's not an abuser. He's just like a human being. He's just like me." Let's unpack this a bit more. There are three factors in this trauma bonding: unequal power, intermittent reinforcement, and fear. Let me give you an example. A woman falls in love. Nothing feels quite like it. It's the best feeling. There's someone who wants her, who gets her, who thinks that she's the most beautiful woman in the world. And then something happens. A shift takes place. Often for a woman in a destructive marriage, it happens on the honeymoon, when all of a sudden, she's not so wonderful anymore. It could be something small, like not answering her text right away, where before he'd always answer it, or it might be a rolling of his eyes, it might be a sarcastic dig, or it might be a verbal barrage of ugliness, or rejection of her physically on their honeymoon. Whatever it is, she feels something new, something that she hadn't ever felt before. She feels fear. Fear that she's going to lose the magic that she had with him. Fear that she did something wrong to cause it. The person who thought she was so wonderful now doesn't think she's so wonderful anymore. And this fear creeps in that she made a terrible mistake. In narcissistic language, the idealization phase has ended and now she's in the devaluing stage. But she doesn't want to believe that. So she ups her game and tries harder and harder to regain value in his eyes again. Now, it doesn't help that Christian counselors or pastors or leaders often counsel her to exactly that. Keep trying harder, honey, to win him back. Of course, now the power differential has shifted. She's afraid, and he has power over her to make her feel worthless, unloved, unwanted, stupid, unimportant. She unknowingly or unintentionally has given him this power, but nonetheless, he now has it. Now, sometimes our clients may recognize that they gave their power away, and they recognize that she gave him the ability to define who she is, and she tries to reclaim it. Or sometimes she doesn't realize it, but for whatever reason, he may start to become his old self again, Mr. Wonderful, loving, charming, attentive. And she begins to relax. Okay, it's not as bad as I thought. We just went through a rough patch. All couples do that. He loves me. Nothing's wrong. And she falls back into his charm. And then it happens again. An abusive incident. A hurtful remark. No apology. No change. It's all her fault. She did something to cause it. And she feels fear. Is it me? Why is this happening? She tries harder. She wants that wonderful feeling back. She wants to be his everything again. She hates feeling afraid that she's failed or that she's not enough for him, that he doesn't want her like she wants him to want her. And on it goes. Years ago, there was a university study on rats. They were given a pellet of food every time they pressed the lever. And then what would happen is that they would press the lever and no food would come. And the rats would get distressed. No food. Yikes. And they would press and press and press and press and press until finally a little pellet would come out. Oh, yum, food, yay. And then they would press again and no pellet would come. Now you'd think that the rats would stop pressing the lever, but actually they pressed it harder and harder. And every once in a while they would get a pellet. And these rats pressed and pressed and pressed and pressed for that one tiny pellet that they would get every so often. And eventually, the researchers did another part of the experiment where they didn't give them any pellets at all to see what would happen. And the rats kept pressing and pressing and pressing because they hoped they would get the pellet. But no pellets came until the rats eventually died, pressing the lever again and again and again. And the study showed the power of intermittent reinforcement to bond these rats to do something over and over and over again. Even though they weren't getting the consistent positive results, they kept at it as long as they could because they hoped and believed eventually something would come. Our clients become biologically as well as psychologically addicted to the wonderful phase and fearful of the terrible phase, which puts them at a huge power disadvantage. You know her, she's the one who studies and reads and tries to figure out why this is happening. She wonders or asks you as a therapist, how can I get him back? How can he change? How do I fix this? All the while she continues to be devalued and abused. I also think the fear of displeasing God and not doing the right thing often keeps many women stuck, pressing the same lever over and over again, hoping God will do something to change him. And also the fear of what he might do to her or the children keeps her stuck trying harder to fix something, instead of doing the work she needs to do to find the food elsewhere and stop pressing that lever. Now, I haven't yet mentioned the betrayal bond, because a betrayal bond comes when our client has come to face with the reality that everything she thought was true about her husband or her parent or her marriage or her church or her friend or her pastor isn't true. That he's lied or pretended or covered up or manipulated her over the years for his own purposes. I remember working with a young teenager who was sexually involved with her teacher. He made it seem like a love affair, and she was totally on board. She argued with me. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a victim of sexual abuse. She was a willing participant. She never said no. She wasn't abused. They were in love. She defended him. She protected him. She lied for him. But as things went over time, the truth became clearer and clearer. He had brainwashed her. She was bonded to her abuser not because of a trauma bond, but because of a betrayal bond. He lied to her about who he was and what he wanted, how he felt, what he was going to do. He used her like a tissue. She was disposable when he had no need for her anymore. To come to the truth of this kind of betrayal causes internal trauma. You don't want to believe that everything you thought that was true of your life, everything you felt, everything you were told was a lie, a fabricated story for someone's selfish purposes. It's way too painful to face that, so you prefer to stay stuck in the deceiver's story. Several years ago, many people were taken in by a charming con artist, Bernie Madoff, who swindled people, smart people, wealthy people in New York City out of their life savings. They believed he was on their side, helping them make the most of their life savings for retirement. But actually, he used them to pad his own luxurious lifestyle, and their life savings were gone forever. At first, when all the news broke out, they were loyal to him. They loved him. They defended him. They couldn't believe the truth, even when it was obvious it was true. But as they faced the reality of their empty bank accounts, they were traumatized by how taken in they had been by this man. You will see many clients facing betrayal and betrayal bonding. She discovers her husband, or he discovers his wife, have been chronically sexually unfaithful. He doesn't care for her personally, but likes the perks of having a wife, a mother to care for his children, a housekeeper to care for his house. Or she doesn't respect or care for him as a person, but likes the paycheck and the perks he provides. But the truth is so painful. Our client is so fearful of facing that truth and subsequent trauma that he or she would rather pretend that it's not that bad, or she doesn't know what she knows. It's hard, it's painful. It does require some hard work, but there is a way out. And so in the next video, I'm going to give you 10 things that you can do to help your clients break free of their trauma or betrayal bonds. Until then, God bless.